There's a version of you that you have never met. Not the version that wakes up in the morning and checks its phone, not the version that rehearses arguments in the shower or lies awake cataloging regrets at 2 in the morning. Not the version that performs confidence at work or shrinks at family dinners or falls apart quietly in the car on the way home. There is something underneath all of that. Something that the most rigorous neuroscientists alive today and the most ancient spiritual traditions in human history have been circling from opposite directions for centuries, only to arrive, startlingly, at the same place. The mystics called it the eternal self, the nameless witness, the ground of being. The scientists call it the default mode network. And what both of them found, using methods separated by thousands of years, is that the self you think you are is not the self you actually are. And the implications of that discovery will quietly rearrange the way you understand everything you feel, everything you want, and everyone you love.
Start with the mystics, because they got there first. In the 6th century BCE, in a forest outside what is now the Indian state of Bihar, a man named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a tree and refused to move until he understood the nature of the mind. What he arrived at after days of unbroken meditation was not a religious revelation in any conventional sense. It was a psychological observation. He noticed that there was a difference between the thoughts arising in his mind and the awareness watching those thoughts arise. The thoughts were temporary. They came and went like clouds. But the awareness itself was something else, unchanging, uninvolved, present. He called this distinction the difference between the constructed self and the witnessing awareness. And he spent the next 45 years trying to teach other people to notice it.
He was not alone. Across the ancient world, in traditions so geographically separated that direct influence was impossible, mystics arrived at the same basic architecture. The Vedantic philosophers of ancient India described the Atman, the innermost self, as distinct from the ego and its endless narrative. The Sufi mystics of the Islamic world spoke of fana, the dissolution of the constructed identity into something more fundamental. The Christian contemplatives, from Meister Eckhart in the 14th century to Thomas Merton in the 20th, described an interior silence beneath all thought that they called the ground of the soul. The Taoist tradition in ancient China pointed to a natural self that existed before social conditioning began to layer itself over the raw awareness of a newborn. These traditions disagreed about almost everything else, about cosmology, about ethics, about the nature of what happens after death. But on this single structural point, they converged with remarkable precision. The self you narrate is not the self you are. There is something watching the narrator, and you have almost certainly never been formally introduced to it.
Now bring it forward, because something happened in the early years of the 21st century that nobody in those ancient forests could have predicted. Neuroscientist Marcus Reichel at Washington University in St. Louis was studying brain activity in resting subjects when he noticed something that did not fit the dominant model of how brains work. He expected the brain to go quiet when it had no task to perform. Instead, a specific network of regions lit up consistently whenever the brain was not engaged with an external task. A network that was, in effect, more active during rest than during focused work. He called it the default mode network, and the scientific community spent a decade arguing about what it was for. The answer, when it came, was both mundane and extraordinary. The default mode network is the network of self-referential thought. It activates when you think about yourself, when you project into your imagined future, when you revisit your remembered past, when you try to model the mental states of other people. It is, in neurological terms, the biological substrate of the story you tell about who you are. It is the narrator, the character, the constructed self that the ancient mystics spent lifetimes trying to see through. And here is where it gets genuinely strange. Neuroscientist Judson Brewer at Brown University spent years studying what happens to the default mode network during experienced meditation. What he found was that long-term meditators showed significant deactivation of the default mode network during practice. The narrative self went quiet. The regions associated with self-referential rumination, with past and future projection, with the endless construction of personal identity, reduced their activity. And crucially, the meditators reported not a loss of consciousness, but an expansion of it, an awareness that was cleaner, quieter, and paradoxically more But why does this matter for you, right now, in your ordinary life with its ordinary complications? Because the default mode network is not neutral. It does not simply narrate your life in a calm, objective voice. Psychiatrist and researcher Norman Farb at the University of Toronto studied the relationship between default mode network activity and emotional suffering and found a consistent pattern. High default mode network activity correlates strongly with depression, anxiety, rumination, and self-criticism. The louder the narrator, the more painful the experience of being alive. Not because life is more painful, but because the narrator is generating suffering by constantly evaluating, comparing, remembering, projecting, and judging. When you lie awake at 3 in the morning replaying a conversation from 6 years ago, that is the default mode network running an uninterrupted loop. When you meet someone new and immediately begin calculating how they perceive you, that is the default mode network modeling its own social position. When you cannot simply sit and watch a sunset without the internal commentary beginning. Beautiful, yes, but I should be doing something. I am wasting time. What does it mean that I am here alone? That is the narrator inserting itself between you and your experience. The ancient mystics diagnosed this problem with extraordinary precision, thousands of years before neuroscience had the tools to measure it. And they also, it turns out, identified the solution. The practice they described, across traditions, was not suppression of the narrator. It was not silencing the mind by force. It was something more subtle and more difficult. It was learning to notice the difference between the awareness that is watching and the thoughts that are being watched. To step back, not in space, but in attention. To find the part of you that is already and always present before the next thought begins. Psychologist Kristen Neff at the University of Texas at Austin, one of the world's leading researchers on self-compassion, describes a closely related concept in secular terms. She calls it mindful awareness, the capacity to observe your own experience from a slight distance without being consumed by it, to know that you are having a painful thought without becoming entirely identical to that thought. And her research shows that this capacity, this small gap between the witness and the narrative, is one of the most powerful predictors of psychological resilience, emotional regulation, and the ability to maintain genuine relationships with other people. The gap the mystics described and the gap the scientists measured are the same gap. Now, think about what this means for the way you experience relationships. Because the constructed self, the narrator, the default mode network, does not only make you suffer in solitude, it shapes every relationship you have. When someone criticizes you and something in your chest collapses, that is the narrator identifying so completely with your constructed identity that an external challenge to it registers as an existential threat. When you fall in love, the early weeks often feel different from the rest of the relationship precisely because the default mode network quiets slightly in genuine connection, and something more direct, more immediate, more real briefly surfaces. Mystics across traditions have described love at its deepest as the temporary dissolution of the constructed self in the presence of another. Those moments are not mystical accidents. They are glimpses of the structure beneath the story.
The tradition the mystics left behind and the science that is now confirming it both point toward the same practical possibility: that the gap between the witness and the narrator can be widened deliberately through practice, through attention, through the willingness to sit quietly with your own experience long enough to notice that you are not your thoughts. You are what is watching them. And that distinction, small as it sounds, changes everything. Because the self that is watching does not need to be defended. It does not need to be impressive. It does not need the approval of anyone in that room. It was present before the first thought you can remember, and it will be present after the last. Every tradition that has looked carefully at the nature of human consciousness has eventually stumbled on it. Every meditator who has gone deep enough has